It's roughly 1200 BCE, and you're a girl of 13 in a mud brick house on the west bank of the Nile, and you've just found blood on your linen and no idea what it means. Nobody warned you. There's no clinic, no pad, no word for this that isn't also a word for something dangerous. There's a strip of old cloth, a room you're suddenly not allowed back into, and a mother who is about to teach you the oldest surviving medical secret in Egypt. Here's the actual question. Not whether Egyptian women menstruated, obviously they did, every woman in every century has, but what you do about it when there is no pharmacy, no plastic, no word hygiene in the sense we mean it, and when the fluid itself is treated by half the ancient world as something that has to be hidden, feared, or ritually managed. So today we're going through all of it. A medical papyrus with an entire section written for women and almost nobody else. A pregnancy test that modern scientists actually tested in a lab, and it worked. A theory about where the pain came from that isn't Greek, even though you've probably only ever heard the Greek version, and a single line on a scrap of broken pottery that tells you more about how Egypt actually felt about this than any temple wall ever could. Let's go. Here's the picture most people carry around, and it's not really their fault, because almost everything we're taught about ancient attitudes to menstruation comes from Rome and Greece. Pliny the Elder wrote that a menstruating woman could turn wine sour and blunt the edge of a knife just by touching it. Leviticus lays out a strict, multi-day system of ritual impurity. And because those texts got copied, translated, and taught for 2,000 years, the assumption drifts backward onto every ancient culture, Egypt included. Blood equals danger, danger equals exclusion. Case closed. Except Egypt didn't leave us that story. Egypt left us a medical document. It's called the Kahun Gynaecological Papyrus, and it's the oldest surviving medical text in the world dealing specifically with women's health, dated to somewhere around 1800 BCE. Discovered at the town of Lahun by Flinders Petrie in 1889. And it's not a religious text, it's not a purity code. It's a diagnostic manual, case after case, laid out in the same clinical format used for treating a broken arm. Symptom, examination, cause, treatment, and a huge share of those cases are built around one variable, tracked constantly, treated as the single most useful diagnostic signal a physician had access to. Whether the bleeding had come, how much, how often, and what its absence or its irregularity was telling you about the rest of the body. That's the detail that should stop you. In Egyptian medicine, the menstrual cycle wasn't background noise to be managed discreetly and never discussed. It was data. A physician, and it's worth remembering, physicians in Egypt were almost always men, would ask about it directly, the same way you'd ask a patient today about their pulse. Irregular bleeding, painful bleeding, bleeding that had stopped entirely, all of it got cross-referenced against a whole catalog of unrelated symptoms because the Egyptians believed something specific and, frankly, strange about how the body worked. They believed the womb could move. Not metaphorically, physically. If a woman complained of pain in her teeth, her eyes, her legs, even her ability to see straight, an Egyptian physician might conclude the womb had shifted position inside the body and was pressing on something it shouldn't be touching. This idea gets attributed to the Greeks constantly. It's usually filed under the word hysteria, which comes straight from the Greek word for womb. But the Egyptian version predates the Greek one by well over 1,000 years, and it comes with its own entirely mechanical treatment. Fumigation. You'd burn something with a foul, sharp smell beneath the woman, the theory being that a wandering womb would recoil upward away from the stench, back into position. Or, depending on the diagnosis, you'd do the opposite. Place something sweet-smelling at the vagina to draw the womb back down where it belonged, like coaxing an animal with food. It sounds absurd until you notice what it's actually doing. It's treating an internal organ as something you can influence from outside the body using smell, which is wrong, completely wrong, and also the first recorded attempt in human history to treat a gynecological symptom as a mechanical problem with a mechanical fix rather than a curse to be prayed away. One case from the Kahun Papyrus lays this logic out almost step by step. A woman is described as suffering pain in her limbs and a disturbance to her vision, and the physician's diagnosis routes straight back to the state of her womb and the timing of her bleeding, not to her eyes, not to her legs. To a modern reader, that looks like a wrong turn. Treating a headache by asking about a menstrual cycle sounds like superstition dressed up in clinical language. But strip away the anatomy and look at the method underneath it. The physician is refusing to treat the symptom in isolation. He's asking what else is happening in the body at the same time, and the menstrual cycle is the variable he trusts most because it's the one thing about a woman's body that can be tracked, dated, and compared month to month with total consistency. Wrong cause, right instinct, correlate everything against the most reliable signal you have. Now, here's where it gets genuinely impressive, and I want you to sit with this one because it involves menstrual blood directly, and it involves an experiment that got run in an actual 20th century laboratory. Tucked into the Berlin Papyrus, a separate medical document, is a fertility and pregnancy test. The instructions are specific. A woman who suspects she's pregnant urinates onto 2 separate batches of grain, 1 wheat, 1 barley, over several days. If the barley sprouts, the papyrus says, she'll have a boy. If the wheat sprouts, a girl. If neither sprouts, she isn't pregnant at all. For most of the 20th century, Egyptologists filed this next to the fumigation cure, charming folklore, scientifically meaningless. Then in 1963, a team actually tested it. They took urine from pregnant and non-pregnant women and poured it onto the same 2 grains. The urine from pregnant women caused significantly more germination than the urine from non-pregnant women. The mechanism, which no Egyptian could have understood, is that elevated estrogen levels in pregnant urine measurably promote seed growth. The gender prediction was worthless, pure chance. But the core pregnancy test itself came out at somewhere around 70% accuracy. 3,500 years before a drugstore test, someone in Egypt had, almost certainly by trial and accumulated observation rather than theory, landed on a real hormonal signal. And the diagnostic habit doesn't stop at pregnancy. The same medical tradition treats a stopped cycle as a red flag worth investigating, prescribes remedies specifically to bring on delayed bleeding, and separately prescribes remedies to slow bleeding that's running too heavy. There's a recipe in the Ebers Papyrus, a later and even larger medical compilation from around 1550 BCE, aimed specifically at a woman whose period won't stop. It calls for a mixture, including plant resins and honey, applied internally. I'd hedge how effective that actually was. Honey has some genuine antimicrobial properties, but there's no clean mechanism by which it would control bleeding in the way the text implies. Still, the instinct to formulate, dose, and record a targeted treatment for menorrhagia 4,000 years ago is not nothing. There's also a whole cluster of remedies aimed at pain rather than volume, which is a detail that tends to get skipped entirely. The Ebers Papyrus lists preparations meant to ease cramping, some involving warmed oils applied to the lower abdomen, some involving ingested plant mixtures whose exact identification is still argued about by translators because Egyptian plant names don't map cleanly onto modern botanical species. I'd hold most of the specific plant identifications loosely for that reason. But the existence of a dedicated pain remedy at all tells you the discomfort itself was taken seriously enough to warrant a formulated response, not just endured in silence as an unavoidable fact of being a woman. So what did an actual Egyptian woman do, practically, day to day, while all of this theorizing sat in a physician's papyrus somewhere else entirely? This is the part where the evidence goes thin, and I'd rather tell you that honestly than invent detail we don't have. Egypt was a linen civilization. Flax was grown, spun, and woven constantly, and linen production and the reuse of worn or scrap linen was a domestic industry every household participated in. The most widely repeated claim, which you'll see stated flatly across a lot of pop history content, is that Egyptian women used softened, rolled papyrus as an internal tampon-like device. I want to flag that claim hard. It traces back to a handful of secondary sources repeating each other, and the primary evidence for it is thin to the point of being almost anecdotal. What we can say with real confidence is that linen was cheap, absorbent, washable, and everywhere, and reused cloth as external padding is by far the more archaeologically and practically plausible answer. The overwhelming majority of Egyptian women, the ones farming, grinding grain, raising children in a mud brick house nowhere near a physician, left us nothing describing what they actually did, thought, or felt about their own bodies. We are reconstructing a medical theory, not a lived universal experience. That gap matters, and pretending it doesn't would be dishonest. And even within that elite medical tradition, the temple restrictions and the diagnostic clinic sat side by side in the same culture without ever getting reconciled, the same way the wands and the doctors coexisted in how Egyptians treated a sick child. Egypt didn't resolve its contradictions, it just ran them in parallel and wrote both down. Here's where this whole story turns over, though. We've been treating this as a story about how a pre-scientific society misunderstood a basic biological process. Wrong organ, invented mechanism, folklore dressed as medicine. But look at what they actually did with the misunderstanding. They tracked it, they diagnosed against it, they built an actual testable intervention around it that happened by accident to work. Compare that to the parallel tradition running at exactly the same time a few hundred miles north, where the identical fluid gets classified primarily as a source of ritual danger to be avoided rather than data to be used. Egypt didn't get the biology right. Nobody was going to get the biology right for another 3,000 years, but Egypt pointed its attention in the more useful direction anyway. So pull it together, because there are three things here. First, the medical one. Egyptian physicians treated the menstrual cycle as clinically significant information, tracked, questioned, and cross-referenced against symptoms anywhere in the body, which is a genuinely modern instinct wearing an ancient, mistaken theory as its clothing. Second, the practical one. Behind the papyri sits an ordinary domestic reality of reused linen, a household routine, and a father logging his daughter's first period on a shard of pottery without a flicker of shame in the handwriting. Third, and this is the one, the wandering womb theory and the wheat and barley pregnancy test are both wrong explanations that happened to produce a right result because someone was paying close enough attention over long enough time that the actual pattern, hormones changing urine, showed up even without the word hormone existing yet. That's not primitive thinking. That's the earliest version of exactly what a modern clinical trial does. Notice the pattern first, understand it later. And it's worth saying plainly that this puts Egyptian medicine in strange company. Most ancient systems we know of reached for a moral or ritual explanation first and a physical one second, if at all. Egypt, at least on this specific question, reached for the physical explanation first, got the anatomy hopelessly wrong, and still ended up closer to a useful answer than a society that never asked the question in a clinical way at all. So picture her again. That girl in the mud brick house, folding a strip of worn linen the way her mother showed her. In a house where the word for this wasn't a whisper. It was just a fact. Logged the same way you'd log a scorpion sting or a missed day of work. She didn't have a diagnosis for what her body was doing. Neither, really, did the physician 2 towns over with his papyrus and his burning herbs, but somewhere between her and him across 3,500 years, something got noticed. Something got written down, and it turned out, completely by accident, to be true. Some version of this is still happening to somebody right now in a room you'll never see, and it's a little less alone than it used to be, because eventually somebody wrote it down properly. So, question for you. Option 1, an Egyptian physician with a wandering womb theory who's wrong about the cause but tracks your cycle like clinical data. Option 2, complete medical silence, no theory at all, nothing written down, nothing asked. Which one tells you more about how a society actually saw its women? Let me know in the comments.